And there was a concern that what we're really talking about, and perhaps always will be, is propaganda of some type. As long as there's a conflict between an accuracy goal and a belonging goal or whatever else, if we think it's likely that the belonging goal is going to win out, which I find completely unsurprising, belonging is so fundamental to our psyche of who we are.
I mean, if you get ostracized in the environment in which most of our brain structure,
how much does it matter if you're right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's even baser than that. If the rabbit in the bush that hears the rustling in the leaves, if it assumes it's a predator and runs away, it loses nothing. You know what I mean?
It's the difference between type 1 and type 2 errors.
Yeah, if it goes and looks, I mean, it risks being right that it was a predator.
And yeah.
So yeah, I'm sure you were very
on that front. One of the questions that I've asked the most on the show, or I hope I've asked the most on the show in conversations, is when I find that I'm having a conversation where we're not getting anywhere, I'll often ask them if they care about truth, and almost everybody will say yes, because we certainly like to think that we care about truth.
Sure, everyone thinks they're pursuing the accuracy goal because it's very difficult to access that you're pursuing the other kinds of goals.
It's put you in a weird position if you say, nope, don't care about truth, don't care about being accurate, just want to believe what I feel like and be with, we fundamentally know that that's a bad way to go through life. And so we just flat out say, no, of course I care about the truth. And yet when I ask them the follow-up questions of, okay, you care about whether or not your beliefs are more likely to be true, how would you go about testing your beliefs to find out if they're true or not? Most of them don't have the first clue of how to properly test something. But also even those who perhaps do have an understanding of how to test it, especially when we're talking in the realm of the supernatural and God beliefs and things, when I ask them, how would you put this to the test? They've acknowledged on many occasions that failing the test certainly doesn't show that they're not correct, and then you get into the post hoc rationalizations about, God works in mysterious ways. Or so when you say, hey, do you believe that intercessory prayer works, praying for someone who's ill? Oh yeah, I believe that works. And then you say, okay, well, an organization that's pro-Christian specifically, the Templeton Foundation, has done at least one, I think two now, studies on intercessory prayer. And because there was some anecdotal data and some other studies that showed maybe there's something here. And then when they test it, they find out that prayer works at the rate of chance. It's a coin toss, which is exactly what we'd expect. And that by definition is this doesn't work. If it's a coin toss, it's not working, it's not doing anything. And they also found that the people who knew they were being prayed for had slower healing times, and they speculated that this was like a performance anxiety, that they know people are praying for them to get better, and if they don't, it might make things worse, and the stress added to this. And yet, even after showing that intercessory prayer does not pass the test, it doesn't have an impact on the people who believe. It's not, because their belief that prayer works isn't based on data or studies, it's based on the confirmation bias of this happened to me, or this happened to my mom, or this, so-and-so was sick and got better and I just know it works. Yeah. And so they're kind of overemphasizing what could be viewed as a hit, even though there's no evidence that it is a hit, while they ignore the misses. If people say, I believe X for this reason, and we know that they don't necessarily have access to what the reason is, or maybe even what the belief is, if we haven't maybe gotten to the core of it. And if when they say, yes, I care about truth and accuracy, what they really mean is, I care about truth and accuracy to the extent that it doesn't infringe on my belonging and my group. It seems that there are only a handful of options. One is to ensure that belonging and in-group, out-group status is predicated on an adherence to accuracy and a value for the truth. And the other is to say, and this is monumentally arrogant, I can't even believe, it's one of the options, so I'm just going to say it, that those people who do care about truth, who are unwilling or unable to convince the people who don't care about it as much or don't have it as a primary thing, perhaps the best course of action and this hurts me to even say, is to set the truth aside and go for propaganda. But that level of manipulation
I hear you saying.
is so rife with
Yeah.
problems.
Do you want to make an emotional appeal?
Right.
And
I'm fine with emotional appeals that are also rooted in the facts.
sure. Well, here's some of my thoughts on that. I think that confidence is an emotion, is the way I feel. So it's felt in an emotional level, and emotion is cognition. It comes from the brain. It doesn't come from
Your heart.
Yeah, it comes from the brain. So an emotion is a cognition. So it's fine. You don't have to think of it as like it's not thinking. It's thinking. You have to ask yourself, if you're the person who's trying to persuade, what is your goal? What do you want out of this? Do you want that person to be factually accurate, or is your goal something else? Like, ask yourself, what is your real reason? Are you attempting to get that person to be right about this very specific thing we're discussing? Are you trying to do something at a more macro level, or if you want to conceptualize it as a deeper level or a higher level, however you want to talk about it? Are you trying to get that person to see the world in a much more fundamentally different way, which would necessitate that they not have this belief? That's a big part of something you need to answer for yourself, because if that's your goal, you're just playing a little whack-a-mole game right now when you're just attacking these low-level beliefs that are only there to justify something deeper. And that deeper thing might just be an emotion that is being generated by these deep drives, which means that we are at the emotional level of discourse, which is a thing that can be rolled into discourse.
We may see this more clearly in the discussions about religion than we do in discussions about political views and other things, because many times we've been able to get somebody down to what I think is as close to their core motivation as possible.
Yeah.
Through the course of a conversation about, oh, well, I believe there's a God, what you really get down to on some occasions is, I want life to keep going. I want to have the opportunity to see my relatives
again. That's what I was
again.
driving at. Like, I think that in those situations, you should take the approach my book takes at least this makes this argument that now you need to enter into we're solving a mystery together situation where we need to help you figure out, and me too perhaps, why this is important to us, but more so like for you, the person I'm speaking with, like help you see the deeper motivation behind your reasoning, like the deeper motivation behind your stated rationalization, justification, explanation, reasons that you're producing. Like that in and of itself can be really all that that may be the better end goal, because that will naturally lead to a person creating a new epistemology. I mean, they'll create them to a new set of reasons, because
the angst, frustration with not knowing what comes after death might drive somebody to accept religious beliefs in spite of all facts or evidence, but making them aware that it is driven by that angst may help. That may be the brick in the wall that you pull out that helps the rest of it crumble.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, we all know is fear-based and things like that.
And this is what happens if you go to therapy. They're not going to say, they're going to ask you, why do you think that? And over and over again. And you're going to come up with these bullshit answers that get less and less bullshit the more and more you discuss the issue. And they'll just, all the great persuasion methods that I think that I highlight in the book are about the work happens on the other side. Like they do that work sort of privately as you guide them, and you are an emotional mirror. It's a lot of,
you learn best when you get this discovery apparently on your own,
yeah,
even if you were guided towards it.
If you're open to it, you can parrot or copy paste another person's flow chart of reasoning into your brain if you're open to it. But if you're not open to it, you're going to have to come up with new reasons on your own using your collection of information. You'll have to use your specific kind of reasoning to get to the conclusion that somebody else may have reached using a completely different kind of reasoning, and that's what you'll have to aid the person in doing. It's a really delicate and strange way of approaching it, because I know I know what a lot of us want is we just want that person to admit that they're wrong.
Yeah.
And just admit that this is, and it feels like that's a win, yay, but that oftentimes is not going to do the thing that you were actually attempting to do.
It can actually backfire in a spectacular way.
For sure.
Well, this has been great. We've gone on nearly an hour, which is longer than
An hour?
Yeah.
What?
It doesn't take that long.
Let me define a belief for you.
Yeah.
The way I define the book, because I didn't answer that. It's strange, but this is how you have to define it if you're going to go in the non-philosophy realm. Because if you're not going to add to 2,000 years of thought on this, and you're going to start over here where they put things in quantified bits that get grants and stuff. It's information encoded in the brain with a emotional tag of confidence. So it has some input from your sensory modalities or some sort of synthesis that's taken place, like it would in like a math problem that's happened all in here. That's information encoded in the brain in some way. And then when you conjure it up as a mental construct, along with it, you have that twinge that says, I am such and such percentage confident in that being true or false. You're not going to actually think of it in terms of percentages. You can do that as you.
We pull wild ass guesses of percentages of things, just because it's easier to talk that way. And we also use the word probably way too frequently, because probability is something that necessarily needs to be calculated. And so we just say, oh, that's probably true. So are you suggesting that it's greater than 51%, which is probably what we're alluding to, but it's not like we can necessarily.
And then an attitude is so different. An attitude is a feeling of attraction or repulsion, or it's a positive or negative. It's valence, as the word it's ambivalent means that you aren't enough positive or negative to be to have a positive or negative attitude.
Right.
So attitude is a purely emotional reaction. If I say key lime pie, you got it. There's your attitude. It's just suddenly happened to you. If I say maggots, you're going to be like, oh, there's my, I would rather eat key lime pie. And then, when I ask you which would you rather eat, it's not necessarily, that attitude is built on beliefs, because those beliefs inform whether or not you have a positive or negative reaction to it. So like when I'm asking, if you want to change somebody's mind, it's important to start with, am I attempting to change that person's attitude, or am I attempting to change their beliefs? Because it's completely different methodologies for approaching one or the other. Although beliefs inform attitudes, attitudes inform beliefs, and it becomes very complicated if you don't.
And in a reductivist sense, when you talked about beliefs, attitudes, and values, and how they're used and opinions, and how they're used interchangeably, from a purely philosophical perspective, a reductivist philosophical perspective, they are the same thing. And they are brain concepts that one accepts to varying degrees of confidence.
Sure, because like this is not a system that has like a chain from one to the other.
Right.
Everything is associative and it's all interconnected.
Because it's like a cake. We've got some flour, some eggs, and it comes together in cake, and it's really hard to unbake a cake.
It really is. And if you can have beliefs about your attitudes, you can have attitudes about your beliefs. It can get very complicated very quickly, which is why if you want to get a straight answer, it's tough.
Yeah, and when you have all the layers of, we stay away from buzzwords, indoctrination, religion, cult, all those things. Just the constant reinforcement of being around people who have similar attitudes, similar values, similar opinions, that constant reinforcement and not engaging with or not being willing to consider alternate perspectives on things.
Yeah, I don't know how much this is being discussed in this community. I don't know how much is being discussed because I have to move through so many different communities to make the podcast. But I know that signaling to your peers, in psychology they call it an affinity group, which sometimes you call that a tribe or something. But the signaling to your peers is a huge deal, right? And a stated belief can be a signal, and a stated attitude can be a signal, and
a virtue.
Yeah,
because we hear about virtue signaling all the time.
So if you're like, I don't eat meat, is stating, a signal to others what kind of values you have and what your attitude is towards certain things. And you may even get to the level of talking about what you do or do not believe. And those signals powerfully affect our belief, like what we actually consider to be true or not. So a flat earther is a great sort of apolitical example of this, where the belief in whether or not we landed on the moon, and the belief for whether or not the Earth is an oblate spheroid, is a
We
signal.
did, and it's not, or it is, and I've always heard. Sorry.
It's a signal to your cohort that you're a good member of that cohort.
Right.
And then mixed in with that are things like NASA is evil, which is an attitude. And if you express to a fellow flat earther, I think NASA's pretty great, like that can really be dangerous to you, but not quite as dangerous as saying that the Earth is not flat. So people who have worked with flat earthers and have watched people leave that community, it's interesting to see that it kind of happens it's like an onion being peeled. It's these concentric rings of they can't give up that core thing first because it's too much of a social cost. So they have to you give up like, I think NASA's okay. I think that that they do good work, and then like you can eventually get to things like, I think the moon is round, but the Earth isn't, and you can work your way down till you finally get to that core thing that if you were to state it out loud would get you ejected. That you have survived the social costs of all of these until you get down to here, and then this one you can probably eject because you've built a strong enough social network around you slowly to the point where you can pop that one off too.
It would be as if, here's my affinity group right now, and there's another group over here that thinks we're wrong, and they're finding a place where those circles overlap so that you can easily kind of move this direction until now you're more invested in perhaps a truth-based group or the other way. You can go either way.
Yes, I saw this with 9/11 truthers, like the people I met who had left that community, like they're leaving it, the changes in their social life led to their changes in their beliefs, not the other way around, which was counterintuitive for me. Like they had to, and what you're saying is exactly what happens. Like you eventually move far enough away socially in increments that you can then afford to be right or wrong about that issue.
But it's what we do physically in reality as well. I was completely within the domain of my parents for a number of years. Then I began socializing outside of my parents, and there's a slightly larger group, and keep doing that. And then when you get to whatever age you're going to leave home and go out in the world, all of a sudden you're interacting with your parents less. You're interacting with those old groups less. We're constantly like testing the water of some other group. Some of us are. Mm-hmm. There are other people who never leave their hometown, never been on a plane, never been anywhere else, don't know anybody that they haven't known their entire life. Mm-hmm. Not to say that there aren't people in those conditions, in those groups, who aren't perfectly reasonable and wonderful people, but it does, I think, make things more rigid, which is why you see both religions that aren't identified as cults and those religions that are, although we should toss out, we're in agreement, let's stop using the cult label by and large.
That's another hour.
Yeah, it's next week. But you can look at it in that sense of, I have my group now, but in the back of my mind is constantly a nagging concern. Have I picked the right group?
Yes.
Fostering that, getting people to doubt that the individuals that they consider themselves kin with or tribe with or whatever else is independent of whether or not, of issues like being correct, is independent of issues of being good or having values that are even we watch people vote against their own best interest because they become convinced that this one issue is the most important thing.
I'm so glad you used that phrase, because what is their best interest in a biological sense? To be right or to not be a pariah in their hometown? So that's
actually a harder question than my initial response was always, it's always better to be right, because having a true and accurate understanding of reality is what's going to keep you from getting hit by the bus.
Which is a very strong value for you, and it's also a big belonging goal for you.
On the other hand, there's the possibility that I could sit around and be completely right and have nobody.
Yeah.
And what kind of life is that?
And most human beings will not choose that option.
And so I would think at a minimum, when you learn these tools, when I was somewhat enlightened by the day the universe changed, for example, and I felt like I'd been properly educated on how to think for the first time instead of what to think, I think for me, I'm convinced there's a moral obligation to share those values, to share that understanding so that other people can grasp it. So we have communities, call them skeptical communities, free thought communities, what, I don't care what the label is. We have communities where truth is and accuracy is a primary value, but also those communities have to include the aspects of community that we would get from anything else.
Yes.
And that means you have to care about people.
Yes. This is hugely important. And on top of that, and this is, I don't know if this is a widely held view, but I hope it is, you have to have empathy for the groups of people who disagree with you or have not been introduced to this way of thinking, who may even hate you. Like, if without the ability to reach out to them and welcome them into this community in some way or another, in a friendly and inviting way with compassion and empathy, cognitive empathy, which is a real phrase that's being used a lot in social sciences right now. Have cognitive empathy for people who are trapped by these other goals that are keeping them away from accuracy. You have to be willing to reach out to people who are they have no choice but to be wrong because they're facing the dark primal fears that we all face when we feel isolated and lonely and ostracized and shamed. Recognize that you're if you want to phrase it, think of it as an opponent, like they recognize what it is that they aim to lose more than if they lose, if they lose the debate with you, they aim to lose a lot more than just that debate. And the welcome them with open arms in your community is a big deal.
It's difficult to remember that, and I'm somebody who always strives to do what I can to make sure that I see both sides of things, which will occasionally get me into trouble. Mm-hmm. And being as charitable of a listener as I can, to constantly remind people to stop pretending that they can read minds and stop assuming what somebody else's motivations are, and instead address what they claim to believe and what the consequences of that are. And so it's really simple for a group like the Atheist Community of Austin. When you're over there tomorrow, we're doing more shows than ever. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people over there at different times of the day. It's an active community that's open 7 days a week, and it is very welcoming. One of the things, everybody who shows up for the first time, there's tons of people there, not just the president or the host. Everybody who's there is participating is eager to make people welcome. And it's because when you show up at the Atheist Community of Austin, you're probably one of us. You're probably, in some cases, fairly new to this and don't necessarily have a community of your own, or you've left another community. And so we're trying to build our community. We want to be welcoming. The things I feel like encouraging strongly is for those of us who have been religious and believed those things strongly, mm-hmm. and been involved, and now we're out. When I engage with people who have those beliefs, yes, occasionally it can be confrontational. You're getting to the core of their identity. I try not to ever just be a dick about it. And one thing I try to keep in mind is I'm talking to that person and the people who are listening, many cases, as if I was talking to the old me.
That's so good, yeah.
And occasionally that means, hey, I'm going to say something that shocks and offends you because I don't get the feeling that you're actually listening to what I'm saying. You're kind of waiting for the next gap in the conversation to say what you want. So I try to be both charitable in remembering that once upon a time I thought like that. How would what I'm saying affect that? But when I talk about trying to see things from both sides, there are, in fact, fundamentalist Christians who found their way into that religion in particular later in life. They weren't raised in it as kids. They weren't indoctrinated. Something happened and they got from A to B. There are even people who say, I used to be an outspoken, ardent atheist. Now, when Kirk Cameron says it, I don't believe it. He's full of crap. Because he used to say he was a devout atheist. That was his language, and I was like, yeah, okay. I'm not a devout atheist. I don't know anybody who's I've never sat on the stage with anybody who's a devout atheist. So you're already kind of making a language mistake there. But I try to remember that it's possible that somebody could have been an atheist in a similar sense to me, and then become convinced of a particular religion. I'm not aware of any good reasons to do that, but there may be. And so if I stop assuming...
Especially, it can happen romantically a lot.
Yeah, but if I stop assuming, oh, I'm up here now and you're down here. You're like, I used to be where you are and now I've graduated and I'm here.
Yeah.
And instead, even if that were accurate, like if I were an incredible mathematician, I've been watching a lot of 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown, and so Rachel Riley's on there, and she's a mathematician, well-educated, but it's possible for her to get the wrong answer to something that I got the right answer to. If we just remember those things, that being right on occasion is different from being consistently right or having methods that are likely to make you consistently right, and the fact that you and I disagree on this thing, even if it turns out that I'm absolutely correct in my position, that's independent from whether I have access. If you don't have access to your reasons, I might not be able to have access to them.
Yeah.
And so the best thing I can do is to try to listen as charitably as possible and try not to assume that I'm necessarily in the better place, which is perhaps why I'm, some would say, pedantic or overly analytical. There was a guy who emailed this week who suggested, why don't you ask people when they started to believe? Because they would have been indoctrinated as children, likely, and everything else. And my response was, well, when you started to believe is irrelevant. And pointing out that you gained a belief or a view when you were young is hardly surprising, because that's where we gain most of them. That's where we gain our foundations. And so whether or not you were indoctrinated is independent from whether or not you're actually correct and whether or not you have good reasoning for that. And somebody else emailed this week. I'm probably going to address this in a different video, because they asked something about, they have concerns that they're not necessarily treating theists fairly in discussion, and they had concerns about whether or not I was treating theists fairly in discussions. And I'm going to dig in on that a little bit. But also I've decided we don't need to stop, because I'm going to cut this video into 2 videos.
That's probably a good idea.
So that
because I'm sitting here as you're talking, I'm like, I've got more on deck, baby. Let's keep going.
and so we can go for a few more minutes, and I'll split this into 2, because I want to make sure if I post an hour and 30-minute conversation with the 2 of us, I know YouTube. There's people who are going to watch for 5 minutes, people are going to watch for 10,
That's
and then
true.
nobody's going to. So rather, let me upload 2 30 minutes. But I probably think, since we've gone on for like an hour and 15 minutes, it's probably best to stick a fork in this, do this again when the book comes out, if not before. See if we can't get you down.
I love visiting here, so I'm more than willing to do that.
Yeah, get you down and maybe get you sit in on the Atheist Experience sometime and talk about stuff. I don't know if you're up for live calls, but
I am.
think
so I used to work in television, and I did the morning show many times, so I'm up for it.
I think you'd have a perspective that'd be valuable, because you're not. I'm the former fundamentalist, current atheist who's out to rid the world of religion. Your view is far more. How do our minds work? How does this get with social interactions? I know that you value accuracy, which is the reason why you pursue why people don't value accuracy.
Yeah.
And when we figure that out,
it's fascinating to me just that, I guess just like when we go back to Burke, I'm just fascinated in how this undercooked flan, shot through with blood vessels does anything at all, and it's fascinating to me that at the fundamental level, what our belief, why do we have these giant disagreements? How do people enter and exit cults? So this whole project has helped me be a lot more compassionate, a lot more empathetic, and has really altered my understanding of the very concept of right and wrong, like what do those words mean, and what does changing your mind mean, and I've been very impressed to see there have been changes within. I mean, there have been schisms with you. People are people all the way through. I know we're sticking a fork in it,
but here, you're fine.
It should be fascinating to everyone in any community. There's been schisms within their community, and that happens within atheist communities. It happens within secular. I mean, why are there schisms? Because people start to disagree on what is and is not so, or should or should not be. And that to me is what's incredibly fascinating, is how does that happen? And how can that happen among people who are seemingly pretty sure that they're...
The fact that it happens in incredibly rigid, structured environments that discourage doubt and questioning. Why is there a First Baptist Church and a Second Baptist Church? And they don't necessarily agree. They'll agree on 99% of whatever, but there's something, and it's not just, we outgrew this building, because then you just build another building and get an annex and you gradually build up to a big church. Why is there Baptist, Pentecostal, sorry Jerry, Pentecostal, Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopalian, Orthodox, all of these. And that's just within Christianity. When you get out broader than that, you've got, Christianity and Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism, et cetera. And then setting aside what religious labels on it, you've got, conservative, liberal,
within each one of those,
Nazi, whatever.
And when I see it within scientific, or basically what I would consider like fact-based communities that are about trying to figure out what is the truth and how can we derive evidence that it will help us have a better idea of, and have a more accurate view of reality, that's to create models that are as close to objective reality as we can get. When I see schisms within those groups, that's when I'm like, wow, this is a really fascinating thing, that there can be internal politics and strife within communities that are attempting to avoid that very thing.
There's a temptation in those who are more philosophy-minded, that what is truth? Do we have access to truth? All of those big things about the foundations of epistemology, and can we trust our reasoning, and do we ever have access to truth? And this is the question that you're addressing. I think is far more pragmatic, because it doesn't seem like we're going to get to a good understanding of what truth is and whether we have access to it, because philosophy's been digging at that for ages and still not there. And the scary thing is that for many it may not matter.
I get that, and I think that's I've seen here on this trip I don't know if this is happening widespread through these communities, but there's a new I like to say there's a I was talking this with Anthony. Everybody goes through the angry phase. There's no zealot like a convert, as they say, right? So there's an angry phase in everything where a person goes, "Wait, I was wrong about that," and they move in the other direction. Past that anger phase in this community is this phase of like how valuable critical thinking is, and how it's not our default way of making sense of the world, and whether it's using methods that are considered the scientific method or some other method, teaching that to people and sharing with people what awesome stuff comes out from using that instead of using these other techniques seems to be a new way of like, I don't know, this may not be new, but it seems new to me. That's a very neat, compassionate, empathetic way to approach things. Like, this is a good tool. You should use this tool for things that you think, but also new things that you might be thinking about, like, buying a car or whatever. Like, you can use this tool for anything. And it's a framework that, oddly enough, has to be taught. And whether or not you're in an institution where that is the basis of the institution, it can be used anywhere. So I see that as like a pivot or something. And I don't know. I haven't quite wrapped my mind around it. But
so one kind of last substantive question. Through the process of writing this book and going through this exploration, talking to experts in a variety of different areas about, how people do or don't change their mind, what the roadblocks are, how messy it is. I'm curious, is it more encouraging? Is it more encouraging or interesting, or however you want to frame it, that we not only don't have an answer right now, but, or at least not a solid one, that we don't necessarily know when we'll get to an answer? Or is it impressive that we understand as much as we do? Are we ahead of the curve, or are we behind?
We're way ahead. I mean, for sure. There are many things. The elaboration likelihood model is this beautiful way of that. It took a lot of effort to create this thing, and there are a couple other ones that are similar. A lot of them share the System 1, System 2 framework, dual process models, as they call them. That is a big deal. And the work of Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, if you have never read the book, The Enigma of Reason, I highly recommend this one. That has put a lot of points on the board. Like it's fascinating that it's fascinating to me that it's still mysterious in many ways, but it's also equally fascinating that so much progress has been made since about 1970. Like that's when the big pushes have come through, because we stopped assuming. There's this thing in science. I know we're ending, but there's a thing in science called the information deficit hypothesis or information deficit model. Mm-hmm. It was just like the CDC used it forever. How do you get people to vaccinate? Give them more facts. The reason people don't change their minds is because they don't know the stuff. And we use that all the time when we argue with people on the internet. Like, if I just show them all these links and all these facts, they'll change their mind, because we always assume the facts that are compelling to us will be compelling to them.
Yep.
That's how we're reasoning our way toward our conclusion.
It's the same thing from the other side as well. When there was a guy I was going to speak to on behalf of a friend of mine, just in a private conversation. She's an atheist. He's a Christian. He's been kind of badgering her a bit, and she's not necessarily equipped or comfortable having the conversations, and certainly not with him. So it was her brother, and I was going to have the conversation with him. And in the first couple messages to potentially set this up, he was like, so I'd love to do this. When we do this, would you pray with me for Jesus to reveal himself to you? And he thought I got angry, and instead I was just frustrated, because it was very clear where this conversation was going. And it's, when you have some experience with something, it's pretty easy to spot both those people who have more experience with it than you do and those who have less. Mm-hmm. And so anybody who thinks that I haven't prayed that way or haven't been asked to pray that way dozens, if not hundreds of times over the years, really is just kind of showing me, what they're trying to get to.
Yeah.
They want, am I open-minded enough to pray with them? And I said, yes, just as soon as you demonstrate any sort of efficacy of prayer, and as soon as you acknowledge that I've probably gone through this pointless exercise many, many times in the past. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to kind of illustrate, you're starting off on the wrong foot, because if we're talking about whether or not there's good reason to believe, if you don't think prayer was the first place I started when I was still a believer, hey, God, I'm here, and got nothing in response. And then I rethought it. I haven't reached out to him again. It's likely he'll call the show tomorrow. And if he does, then I'll say, okay, I'm more than happy to pray with you. I've prayed live on the show before. But I think you'd agree that if we prayed and the God of the universe revealed himself to me in such a way that it was convincing and compelling, well, that's cool. But if I do pray and nothing happens, are you going to then stop believing that there's a God? Or are you going to come up with well, you didn't do it in the right way or with the right heart, or you said the words, but you're so close to it? And so there's nothing about this pray with me, air quotes, test that is an actual test, because there's no outcome. There's one outcome that would make the two of us wind up agreeing. And all of the other outcomes, you can just come up with whatever post hoc rationalization you want.
Yeah.
And if it were to happen when I prayed with you, I mean, that'd be interesting. But then the first question is, why didn't it happen any of the other times? And still, I would now be in a position where I need a whole bunch of answers and understanding and explanation, because my fundamental view of whether or not something is reasonable to believe has nothing to do with, did I have an experience that some people would explain as supernatural or describe as supernatural? Because I've had plenty of experiences that other people would describe as supernatural. I just don't see the warrant for that, justification or for that explanation.
I hear you, and I hear like you walking through the way you would approach the what's happening and turning it into evidence for or against, beliefs that you hold, confidences that you hold, right? like that system is what that person needs more than anything. Like to be able to work through the problem the way you're working through it. So, like however it can be done to give a person the opportunity to work through the problem in a similar way. That's like the great that's the great challenge, is because like getting them to reach your conclusions is one thing, but giving them the tools to reach conclusions in general in any way whatsoever is the big challenge.
Yeah, the conclusions are important because what we believe and accept informs our actions, and they have consequences. It's the methods that are far more important. And what he's essentially kind of asking me to do is, if somebody said, I'd really like it if before we went to the craps table, you would rub my lucky rabbit's foot with me. Would you be open-minded enough to rub my lucky rabbit's foot? Well, it's not a matter of being open-minded. I have no problem saying a prayer. I have no problem rubbing a rabbit's foot. It's the underlying model that's in that person's head of what they think they're going to prove by this test can never be proved by that test.
Yeah.
I rub your lucky rabbit's foot, I throw the dice, I get a 7 and went on the pass line to start with. And even if I got 8 7s in a row and just kept winning or whatever else, there's still no connection necessarily to the rabbit's foot.
Yeah. That's why I wrote You Are Not So Smart in the first place. Like, it is like a very stealthy book on critical thinking that people have no idea that's what that book is about. It comes across as this quirky coffee table book, which in a lot of ways it is, but people read it who I get emails and stuff all the time from people who read it who have I've given speeches and lectures in front of the Catholic Church, and there's copies of the book everywhere, and it's this critical thinking book about that is stealthily offering people.
I think you're getting ready to break my heart.
What do you mean?
So I'm imagining you in a Catholic church with copies of your book, You Are Not So Smart, and giving a lecture about critical thinking and everything else. And what percentage of the people in that church not only would happily leave with a copy of your book, but leave with a copy of your book and an unwarranted confidence that they are good critical thinkers.
Oh, that's everybody.
And that they're really,
That's everybody. I mean, Shermer has...
So maybe that's why we get to the second book, because the first book didn't change as many minds as you perhaps hoped.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
Shermer is, I only wanted people to have the opportunity to see that, like, that everyone is biased, everyone has flawed reasoning. Like, that's and once you get that, it could go anywhere. But as Shermer, he said that, and you see this, there's dozens and dozens of studies that show this. The more educated a person is, the smarter they are by whatever measure you use to judge people's intelligence, the better they are at rationalizing and justifying their incorrect beliefs.
There's a quote from somebody, I forget, that smart people are exceptionally good at rationalizing things they came to believe for not smart reasons.
Yeah, I mean, the intelligence, higher intelligence scores and higher levels of education lead to stronger attitudes and beliefs about climate change in both directions, because those climate change beliefs are mainly determined by your social cohort. Do you hang out with people who don't believe in it, or hang out with people who do? So my roundabout thing I'm trying to talk about here is that the tools of critical thinking are really important, because straight educating people, making them smarter about like Saturn and Jupiter and Mars, or standing there in front of the Catholic Church, like the facts that I'm maybe spreading in the lecture is not nearly as important as showing them, like getting them to commit confirmation bias live on stage, and everybody's like, oh my God, that's a thing I do. Showing them eyewitness testimony is unreliable for these reasons. That stuff I have a belief, is that word work maybe, that does something somewhere. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, maybe we'll find out that more educated, more intelligent people may, in some cases, lead to kind of more rigid thought, but also I would argue that education is about the only solution that we ever have. It is as close to a solution for the lack of education and experience is I think, the cornerstone of like Dunning-Kruger effect stuff. You don't know how good you are or how good you could be until you know what the limits are of it. And maybe just building an interconnected, broader community where you get as close as you can to the experiences of other people.
It's huge.
To make you aware of the limits of your own experience and how that's affecting how you think.
It's huge. Gaining perspectives from other people is the surest path to getting a three-dimensional view. And these are all metaphors, but a three-dimensional view of anything. And saying, like, even if we disagree on something, like realizing that there's a third thing, which is the like, you know some things I don't, I know some things you don't, and that means there's probably a higher level of understanding of this issue than neither one of us has.
It's literally happening right now. As this video is being watched by people out there in the future, there's going to be somebody out there who knows far more about all of this than either one of us.
Yeah.
And when you realize that you're actually that person, by all means, contact David and me. I'm really excited and looking forward to the book. I'm glad you actually had the opportunity to come down. We'll definitely get David back down once the book out, if not before, just depending on schedules. Let everybody know where they can find you,
Everything's at youarenotsosmart.com. The podcast is You Are Not So Smart. You don't have to go to the website. You can find it anywhere that podcasts are put out. And you can type my name into Amazon and find all my stuff. So most everything is under the label of You Are Not So Smart. The second book is You Are Now Less Dumb. The third book will be called How Minds Change. And it will come out sometime, eventually.
Sometime eventually. I want to thank you so much for doing this. I know we could probably keep going for another few hours, and he's not lying that we have been talking for hours everywhere.
It's so true.
We were at dinner, and I was like, how about we shoot a video and we'll touch on this, this, and this. And I think both of us probably knew that we were going to touch on 15 or 20
so true.
Other things as well. But I love having you down here. I've missed you since the last time you were here. We look forward to getting you back. And I'll be back. There's a handful of videos, by the way. By the time this goes up, I will be on my way to Dragon Con. And this is being filmed in 2019, where I'll be doing part of the Magic and Skepticism show.
You look at me as if, is it 2019?
Yeah, well, we've been talking a while. It could be 2020.
I agree.
Anyway, thanks everybody. I'll put this up in 2 videos, and there'll be more coming from the Atheist Debates Project. Be sure you tune in and check out, if you are a podcast listener, the You Are Not So Smart podcast, and start going through the backlog, because you'll hear a lot of really good discussions where it's not just, oh, here's what I think, which is what 90% of podcasts I have heard. Podcasts that I've heard are, here's what I think. And instead it's, I have questions. Let's see if we can find the best answers or the best path to answers, even if we don't find the best answers right now. And for that, we go to people who are experts. I say we. David goes to the people who are experts in the field. And I really, it's the easiest podcast for me to recommend, and has been since the first episode I heard. So we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.